Carina is a developer, advocate, and certified sex educator. She spends a lot of time thinking about the unexpected cultural effects of our decisions as programmers. This talk will expand on themes explored in her PyConAU 2015 keynote, Consequences of an Insightful Algorithm, to delve into how biometrics are misunderstood, misrepresented, and misused for a wide range of harms that include human rights abuses. Carina is also the founder of Callback Women, which is on a mission to radically increase gender diversity on the podium of professional programmers conferences. Just before I hand over to Carina, I'm going to read through a quick content warning, and then we are good to go. So this talk discusses sensitive topics, including surveillance, human rights violations, contemporary racial and religious genocides, famine, wildfires, politics, protests and dissidents, racism, policing, violence, carceral systems, welfare systems, sexism, misgendering, stalking, ageism, religion, immigration and border control, disabilities, mental discrimination, COVID-19, mental health and other medical conditions, and terminal illness. I'll pass over to Carina. We can't wait, Carina. Enjoy.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm very glad to be back at PyConAU, even though we can't see each other. As you heard in the content warning, this is the kind of talk that's got a whole lot of things to be wary of, but I also think it's a really important thing to be thinking about and discussing and being willing to deal with our discomfort with some really hard stuff that is being done with what we build. So biometrics are widely regarded, I think, by the public and probably by most developers as basically just a heightened form of security, associating it with things like either being able to, unlock a phone with your face or your fingerprint, or being able to use similar things to as like second two-factor auth, multi-factor auth, right? But the actual track story, when you talk about biometrics, is very different and has a much longer history than the kind of things that we conventionally compare it to or see as kind of a comfortable benchmark. They're technologies that are systematically making the world a less safe place and have been for a very long time. And we have an obligation to do something about that. And I really think the good news is that we have a lot of power in this situation to help people who are powerless. Next slide. There we go, sorry. So you already heard the content warning, but I want to put it on screen nonetheless, if nothing else, as someone happens to fast forward, I want to make sure that they see this. And I am not going to be jumping right into those. So you've got a little time to, as you hear about the sort of Biometrics 101, to be considering about how long you want to go if necessary. So what are biometrics? At the heart of it, biometric should be something that is unique, a measurable body trait that is unique to just one person, one body. There is no such thing as kind of unique, mostly unique. Personhood is also not a measurable. Your identity is not a metric. This is something that often gets misrepresented. And so you have things like moods and gender and race called biometrics, and we have classifiers for them. They are not biometrics. There's no such thing as being, well, I suppose we get really sort of philosophical about it and say that there's such a thing as a uniquely mixed mood, that you're the one person ever. But could you be identified by your unique mix of internal moods running through your head? No. Gender is defined very differently around the world. Have many indigenous cultures where there's far more than two genders. We also have in some cultures collective genders, such as in India. A third gender is actually comprised of multiple different genders, at least as they would be thought of in other cultures. So, and then you have multiracialism, of course. And again, it's possible that there might be one person who has your exact combination of racial and ethnic history, but you're going to have to go back through a lot of generations, and none of us really knows that. Then you're getting into talking about DNA, and DNA and race are two very different subjects. So again, biometric has to have metrics, and they have to be unique. So things that are constructs, states, anything that's just about internal knowledge that's not measurable, things that can be expressed in flexible ways, which includes gender expression, things that are really cultural bound in how they're understood, things that have so many facets that you really can't nail them down. All these kinds of things are not metrics, and yet they're constantly tossed out as metrics and used as with great assurance that this here is an identifier. We know something about you, and that will come back later. So that means that we have at least 3 categories of things that are absolutely positively not a biometric: mood, gender, and race. And junk science about those is all over the place. And that too we'll have to revisit later. So unique doesn't mean that it can't be mutable, because there are many biometrics that can and do change. We have accidents, we have mutations, we have surgery, we have, any number of ways in which the body includes things like aging, diseases, amputation. There's so many possibilities for how something that is unique to you can be unique to you in a different way at a different point in life. However, that doesn't mean that there could be something that is more unique. It either is or it isn't. That's the nature of the word. It's polar. However, there are metrics that are easier for us to measure and then easier for us to analyze and harder for us to attack. And so there are ones that are not necessarily better differentiators, but they're easier to deal with. And so they become treated as better. Biometrics is often described as a category of AI. Actually, biometrics predates AI by at least a century, maybe 2. It goes back well into 1800s colonialism. 120 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi was busy organizing against fingerprint recognition. He understood that this was being used to oppress people in South Africa. It was being used as a colonial tactic, and he realized that he had been part of its organization, and he regretted it. So the fundamentals of biometrics aren't new. It's the same basic principles being applied to faster processors, bigger data, and very contemporary perils. So we get this misrepresentation that biometrics are intelligence, artificial intelligence, right? But they're not. They're pattern recognition. Biometric analysis is in some ways really dumb. Rather than being intelligent, intelligence requires some sort of comprehension, an ability to extrapolate beyond what is there. Biometrics is predictive math. It is guessometrics. It's precision guesswork. So we've got various categories, and you kind of, there are 2 that are really widely agreed on, and then there's a third that's a little less certain as to whether there's an appropriate label for it and whether it even is quite biometric. So let's look at the 3. So the physiological ones are the ones that we're most familiar with, for instance, fingerprints, anything that's a surface, an organ. So skin being one of those, obviously, eyes, earlobes, all sorts of fun things that I'll go into more detail about. Behavioral biometrics would include things like our actions and rhythms. For instance, just waving the hand, gesture recognition is one. Another might be gait is a very common one to analyze. It's looking at the biomechanics of walking, various ratios of bones and angles, etc., and the rhythm of how we behave when doing these things. And then there's that third category I mentioned of neurological responses. And this is stuff that's involuntary. So our heartbeat, for instance, our synaptic pulses, those sorts of things that are biological but beyond our control. And again, that's an example of something that's mutable. Your neurological responses can change with any number of, say, medical disorders, a brain tumor, Alzheimer's disease, certainly a brain injury of some kind. Those can change, heart surgery. So these aren't things that are always and forever you, but they are something that are personal to you, unique to you, allegedly. And that's going to get into another question mark. Because while there are a lot of traits, not all of them are biometric, even among the ones where vendors speak about them as if they are. And when trying to go and find information to give to you about which are definitely for sure guaranteed unique, it's actually really hard to find reliable information. And I went looking at actual academic research, not just to vendors and their claims. So I'm really, I tried to make a chart, and the chart ended up being wildly incomplete. So I'm going to give you what I can, and I want you to know how much we don't know everything, or certainly that you won't know everything today. So we have those three major categories, right? And then we have some that there seems to be broad consensus that the science supports as being genuinely unique, and that is finger vein patterns, palm vein patterns, face vein patterns, and DNA. And that's true even of, say, twins. And behavioral biometrics, the consensus is that gait is unique. Again, that could be mutable. You have an injury, certainly if you have an amputation, your gait's going to be altered by amputation, right? And some people potentially don't have a gait for various reasons. So then we get into cognitive, and cardiac signature is said to be unique. It was hard for me to find absolute confident evidence. I believe that that has been established. I'm just not going to be able to say, yeah, I'm not a doctor. From what I could tell, the doctors seemed to believe so. I just didn't see enough. Okay, so not unique, definitely. Irises are not unique. Hand geometry is not unique. DNA of identical twins, not unique. Notice it's in both. Yes, there's consensus and then there's not. Do I know? No. This is why I said this chart is pretty wonky. Skin color, not unique. This one should be really obvious, right? There is a infinite variety of skin colors. Skin reflectance, which is used as something of a proxy for skin color. And in some ways, we need to really look very carefully at that, because there's research that thinks it's looking at skin color and is actually looking at skin reflectance. Anytime you're taking a photo of skin, what you're really taking a photograph of is reflected light. And some skin is far more reflective than others. If we think about just basic science, black is the absorption of all light and white is the reflectance of all light. So skin color itself has a variety of reflectance. In addition, things like, say, sweat are going to change reflectance. So you've got all these studies that think that they're talking about skin color, and oftentimes we're not acknowledging very well or at all that what they're, and occasionally vice versa. So we've got some problems there. Behaviorally, it's not clear to me what else is unique. There are some that have made claims, and I was not able to establish. Researchers definitely have mixed conclusions on fingerprints. Again, twin studies, not clear. Everyone's very confident in giving their assured answer that conflicts with somebody else's. And then the ones that are truly just completely unclear to me, and there's a bunch of those, palm print, and I distinguish that from palm vein. So that palm print, fingerprint, those are the ridges, the patterns of swirls that are of physical ridges, whereas veins would be obviously the vascular structures underneath the skin. So surface of skin versus underneath. Facial geometry, voice, retina, and periocular orbit or periorbital area refers to this area right here around the brows, the eye sockets, even the little stuff at the corner of your eye there, that little patch of skin. So this whole region, essentially where one's glasses would be, or are in my case, that's the periocular or periorbital region. Earlobes, tongue print, yes, there actually are people trying to sell products with tongue prints. Palate rugae, which is stuff up there, the bumpy stuff on the top of the roof of the mouth, and body odor, which I swear I can only think of one reason to use that, and that would involve military. Okay, so, and then behavioral, that's where you get into a lot of the ones where it's really unclear. Things like head pose, handwriting stroke order being different from verifying a signature. This is how do you form the signature itself? So the physical act of it, rather than how it looks at the end. Do you move your hand this way or this way when you cross a T? Do you dot your I at the end or as you start to make the character? Those sorts of characteristics. So gestures, eye movements, head movements, the cadence of your typing, handwriting stroke order. So, oh, I'm sorry, that's the duplicate. Handwriting speed and geographic movements. Geographic movements is considered a behavioral biometric. Again, I think there's a point where you move around enough in life that inevitably it narrows you down to one person, but is that quite the same thing as unique? I don't believe so. But this is an issue with biometrics, is that there's a lot of fuzziness. And then we've got neural responses and blood flow pulse. All right, so like I said, this chart is not ideal. And in that way, because I can't give you absolute certainty, I don't want you to take absolute certainty from it. So this isn't a chart to use and consult. It's a chart to look at and say to yourself, I need to go research. If I'm going to use anything with biometrics, I should take a lesson from this and dig deep to find out whether the claims are actually supported by bona fide, rigorous science, and whether there is consensus that it's not just one study, that it's not just a vendor-sponsored study, that there is a good sample size, control groups, randomization, etc. So where do we get this kind of data? Well, a lot of common sources are either government or commercial. So CCTV cameras are really popular, especially say, for instance, in the United Kingdom and in China. Driver's license databases, national identification, social benefit services such as pensions, school IDs, passports and visas, law enforcement like mug shots, things like that. And then you get commercial products such as Ring and Alexa and all those things, your health watch. And of course, social media stuff. Every time you tag a photo, you've created some useful data for biometrics and scraping thereof. So all of these become the sort of slapdash, in some cases, sources, and other ones that are all being glommed together, private and public. And so there's this sense that just combine algorithms and more data and you'll get more accuracy. But there's a lot more ways to skew a variable than just not having enough data. And this is something that gets really understudied. So looking at type and distinctiveness, cooperation. Did the person pose for the reference photo that you're being compared to? Or was it taken at a party in dim light with over their shoulder so that you capture mostly just a portion of their face, right? Were they trying not to be identifiable? Were they wearing goggles, for instance, at a protest? What kind of sensors were involved? How high quality? Were they maintained well recently? Have they been calibrated? Are you comparing the same sensors? Data quality in other respects? Distance, a photograph taken from far away versus one that's close up obviously has different granularity of data that we can look to. What was the duration for something that involves behavior? A sampling of a second or two is different from being able to surveil someone constantly and have an almost limitless supply of data accumulating on how they behave. Environmental conditions, low light, is there rain, disguising their gait, or changing it just because they want to get inside real fast? What kind of activities are involved? Body changes, someone changes weight, well, their face geometry might not change, but it may become visible in different ways. Or again, an injury or an illness. Clothing. One of the easiest ways to disguise gait is to wear a long coat or a long dress. So these are things where just by wearing different clothing, you get different levels of accuracy. One's health conditions, hormones. For instance, we'll talk about this later. Temperature sensors are really popular now to deal with COVID-19 screening, and hormones are one of the ways that our temperature is being constantly changed for reasons other than fever. So throughout the day, throughout the month, throughout our lifetimes, as we age, our hormones start to recede in general. Obviously, things like menopause versus puberty. So all of these things where you might have fixed attributes, they still be influenced by other external forces. And then we get to some big ones like race, gender, and culture. All of these certainly affect the accuracy and our assumptions about these as well. So when you get garbage in, bias, assumptions, labeling by third parties, reactivity, noisy data, threats, all this sort of stuff means that garbage in becomes garbage out. You get discrimination, junk science, waste, and ultimately, this is the big concern of this talk, oppression. So psychometrics, looking at some of the things that are involved here. Are you alive? Are you awake? Why would this be necessary to know? Well, passive aliveness detection is basically, let me try that again. It's used primarily with things like Face ID to prevent spoofing. Otherwise, it's actually pretty trivial to fool facial recognition sensors a lot of times with nothing but a photograph. Just hold it up. Or for that matter, if your kid can simply take your phone while you're sleeping and hold it over your head and unlock your phone that way, that's not a really good validation, is it? So passive liveness is meant to detect, is this person moving? Are we getting all dimensions of them, et cetera? Do they appear to be awake, feverish? And then looking at mental states. A lot of this stuff is not actually any kind of biometric at all. It's an extrapolation from a biometric. It's a conclusion reached. Like emotion is not measurable, but you can measure something else and then assign an emotion to it. You can say that this appears to be anger. This appears to be someone who is constantly angry or suspicious, and thus I think I know something about their character and their tendency to criminality. They seem to have a lot of stress. So maybe they're hiding something, or maybe they're overworked. Maybe they're really dedicated. So you get this step away from actual biometric to a pseudo biometric, and psychometrics a lot of times fit in that area. And then you get the social identity ones that I mentioned before: race, gender, age. Those are just not at all something that is a measurable physical trait. So why do we do this? Well, for things like financial areas, industries, so retail, banking, et cetera. Also, though, a lot is just for basic services, access to food, SIM cards, transit, welfare, schooling, policing, preventing incarceration, being tracked for probation, employment screening, immigration and visas, and even medication. There's a product in Canada for a biometric opioid vending machine. So more and more, the tendency is to find ordinary things in life that probably should have been private anyway, and that you probably want to keep private, and turn it into something tied to traits that are very hard for you to change and follow you wherever you go. Predictive policing is one of the really big controversial areas. And when I looked at the whole spectrum of sort of steps in the process, there's only one that I know of in which biometrics are not already being used to make decisions. And the only part that I'm aware of is conviction. At every other stage, decisions about how to patrol, which areas to patrol, what's worth investigating, what counts as a lead, who to arrest, how much bail to set, whether to go to trial, sentencing, parole, every part of it is influenced directly by biometrics. Maybe not in every country, maybe not in every system, but this is widely available technology in use today by carceral systems around the world. Yes, and has been for a while. Typical compliance type stuff or other reasons why biometrics are commonly used. So when we think about security, we're thinking usually about access control. So losing valuables, loss prevention. And that's the kind of stuff that is a concern of, say, commerce and finance, right? When I'm talking about unsecurity, though, I'm talking about access and control, access to the public sphere being conditioned on ceding your personal control. So then you get that multimodality that I talked about. So EduTech is a great example of this. It's really been excited about doing multimodal tracking, particularly of gaze, in order to make all sorts of value judgments about a student's learning and beliefs about what can be knowable from how one's eyes move. It's also being used for facial identification. So combining these three things is sort of epitomizing where we are right now with EduTech. And as EduTech perfects this kind of model, it becomes something to commercialize in other ways, to repackage, to sell to, who are the biggest buyers of technology? Governments, always governments. So as you triangulate, you get all these different aspects, right? Combined from various sensors. And there's so many that we're just constantly giving up our data to. And if you look at that second column, ECG, EEG, EKG, I mean, those are medical sensors, and yet they're being widely deployed now in just consumer products. And for predicting things like, whether you've been asleep. Infrared skin temperature sensors and thermal scanners are both being used to make predictions about whether one has a fever. So again, those are COVID-19 products. It's amazing. I've been following this whole field for a while now, and it was by, I would say, January or February, very early on in the pandemic, that there just started to be a feverish excitement in the industry about being able to suddenly find new markets for fingerprint recognition, facial recognition, and iris readers, and skin temperature sensors. All those being things that could be contactless identification, and trying to find ways to package them up together and remarket them. And it's been really explosive, just incredible to watch and scary. So our typical idea of threat modeling is pretty conventional. You think about things like authentication versus authorization. So authentication being essentially this thing exactly matches that thing. If I put in a password, you can't be close. There's no, this almost matches, it's one digit off, not if you're doing it right. You have to have the exact authentication token. You have to have the exact SMS code that was sent to you. Whatever it is, you have to have a one-to-one match. It's absolute. Authorization documents also typically are in this category. So things like a driver's license, it either does or does not match you. Maybe comparing, say, a driver's license to a lease and a birth certificate, something like that. These are all definitely the same person for sure. That's the conclusion that's been drawn. Credit card. This credit card is that credit card. Yes, you're allowed to use it. We don't know who you are, but the person, this card can be used. Now, then you get to this other category where biometrics lie, and that's probabilistic. Absolutes are not its realm. It's about what is the likelihood. So this seems to be that. It's very like that. It's pretty like that. Or looking at attributes. This seems to fit some of these categories. It seems closer to this one than that one. How much closer? So conventional threat modeling, think about Well, first, you need to understand what the system is, model, list threats, what kind of impact could they have, what are the risks, and then revise your plan in light of this information. So with biometrics, what's the threat model? Well, it's pretty similar to what you'd see elsewhere: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of services, and elevation of privileges. And each of those biometrics are rife with easy ways to spoof. Not every single one equally easy, but just start combing through some old DEF CON recordings and you'll find every single year all sorts of fun ones. Fun is the wrong word. In particular, with spoofing, you get into some really easy ones, such as contaminating the data itself, messing with the sensors, changing algorithms, or bypassing altogether. An example of bypass in China during the peak of the epidemic in Wuhan, people were propping open their biometric locked buildings, simply propping open the door so that you didn't have to deal with the lock. You could just walk on through. So the system can be really, really good at matching, but if someone just made it so you don't need to deal with it, problem solved. What's the impact of a misidentification or an unauthorized access to the kind of intimate stuff that biometrics are used for? So when I say security and unsecurity, I'm talking about two very different things. What I'm calling insecurity is not a euphemism for poor security. It's unsecurity is poor people losing food rations. It's the least privileged people losing even more of their autonomy just to streamline inconveniences to the lives of those who have more power and more privileges than they do. Unsecurity is the undoing of safety. It's the unraveling of autonomy, of fundamental safety, of human rights, and existential threats. So, for example, refugees unsecurity. The world's largest refugee camp is in Bangladesh. There are over 1 million Muslim Rohingya who have fled from Myanmar, where they are the subject of what is widely called genocide. This is a map of some of the camps. More than 1 million people have been living in these camps for 3 years now. The United Nations describes the atrocities committed against them to be genocidal in intent. I didn't want to get too graphic, so this is as graphic as you're going to get, and I have provided links here and elsewhere to more information about just how bad it is. And this article is particularly compelling because it's about how the UN's good intentions to help refugees has also put them at much greater threat. So let's look at how. The United Nations requires aid recipients to provide their biometrics. This has been true throughout the world for years now. It's not just the Rohingya, it's various fleeing populations throughout the world. When you literally have nothing left but your body, and then they want that too, how does that feel? 7.2 million refugees' biometric data has already been taken by the UN, although that's really an undercount because that was the number 2 years ago. They're fleeing violence and persecution on the very basis of their identities. It's their Muslim, ethnic, and religious identity that is why they're targets. And now their most intimate information is being collected and stored in a database over which they also have no control. Now, this is taken from the UN's own website about the program, and it's this sort of singing its own praises, which is the title to do, but it's full of all the reasons that this program is really helpful and beneficial and useful and good, and it's full of benefits like making things much more efficient for the UN. The most that is said from a refugee's perspective about how great it is this. I can be someone now. I am registered globally with the UN, and you'll always know who I am. Out of those 7.2 million people, apparently the warmest thing you could say is that you'll know who I am. There are genuine, deep concerns and needs here that the UN is trying to meet. But you also have to look at this and say, when the refugees are willing to go on hunger strikes, as they have in some cases, in order to not be included in this database or to be represented differently in this database, then why is the only warm, fuzzy thing that you can find from any of these people be, you'll know me? This is from, again, that same page. What's taken is fingerprints, irises, and face prints. They're kind of slippery about really admitting whether they do or don't take face prints, but in various places they do talk about their facial recognition scanning, including in this caption here. This is from a protest at one of the camps, the biggest camp, in honor of the anniversary, honor is the wrong word, marking the anniversary of the onslaught of the genocide. Consent to have your biometrics taken is an obscene fiction when you have this kind of extraordinary power imbalance where agencies are controlling access to your food and supplies, where you're refugees fleeing atrocities. And the same is true of governments versus anyone who's helpless and trying just to stand up for themselves. Host countries and NATO countries alike are weaponizing their access to those UN biometrics, and they're using it to control movements, deny access to driver's license and other privileges, enforce bans on employment, maintain forcible segregation, surveil populations and individuals, and crack down on protests such as this, and commit atrocities against the people that they're supposedly helping. And they're doing it with the UN's support and encouragement and facilitation. It's no longer enough to think about the internet or data or smart devices as independent things. We have to start thinking of them as part of a wider system that includes holistically climate, economics, politics, and power. So let's look at education. Big one right now, right? Education unsecurity. Well, in schools, faces, fingerprints, behavioral biometrics, and of course, again, temperature have become very popular ones to use for monitoring entrance and exits, attendance, meal eligibility. Have you paid for your prepaid, lunch program, and for messaging even between students, teachers, and parents. Here's an example. Actually, I'm going to go back for a second to that. So then you have remote edutech, sorry. And that's been using face biometrics, behavioral biometrics, and as well as cognitive ones. So for instance, do we believe that you are watching the part of the screen that you're supposed to be watching? Are you awake? Do you seem to have your gaze fixed? Has your gaze wandered away at all from the screen? They're quite serious, and students are penalized. It's also used for proctoring, and this is where things get pretty darn creepy because there are a number of platforms for online proctoring, and the way the students describe them, the way the companies even describe them, is really very akin to stalking, where literally a student has to turn their laptop around to show a 360 degree of the room and prove that there's nothing in there but their laptop, and they get told, oh, see those CDs behind you on the shelf? You have to put those away. Why? Who knows? But the fact is that someone is looking that closely at what's in the background of their home, and telling them how to censor it, telling them how to control their space, being controlled by a stranger in their own home, by the use of tech technology that's relying on that notion of the gaze is everything, tells us everything we need to know about your honesty. So regulators in Sweden, France, Poland, and Norway have all ruled that facial recognition in schools violates sections of GDPR, and in part because it's exploiting a power relationship there, where if you can't say no without losing access to education and meals, then that's not consent, that's coercion. And also that GDPR requires that there be less intrusive ways to meet the goal. So a child can show a school ID, a teacher can take attendance, a child can show proof of meal payment, et cetera. They can keep a list of accounts. There are all ways that are even just analog that meet the goal without having to intrude on the child's body like that. A school is allowed to use facial recognition for teachers and families to communicate, and that ended up exposing actually a lot of data for the families because there was a breach. Surprise. And so that information was unnecessarily collected, unnecessarily shared, and then permanently exposed. You get this thought stalkery, like I said, that proctoring stuff. So we had the gaze tracking. It's not just of students, it's of workers as well. So you get detection of eye, face, angle of gaze, what's the direction, what movements are they making relative to that fixed point in their eyes, assumptions about what that means, and what kind of interpretations to assign to use it, what mental state is it, are you sad, are you contemplative, are you rebellious, are you being compliant, are you doing your homework, are you watching the correct part of the page that the teacher is pointing to, are you being productive enough. This is obviously all interpretations of a gaze. A gaze is not productive. A gaze is not distracted. These are internal mental states. But there are real consequences imposed for these. You could fail a class. You could lose a promotion. You could lose your job. You can lose trust. And the consequences for that are also to the institutions that use them and misunderstand, because it means that people are underestimating and all the loss of talent that happens because of that. And there's also consequences for society as a whole as we have people fall through the cracks. And all of this is expensive. We're paying for systems that are doing harm and not delivering something useful. And I actually I want to emphasize that I don't think that's a balance to be striking. So knowledge is power. We know this, right? That's sort of a motto of education. Knowledge is power, but biometrics alter power. Here's a product. This is a manufacturer's own website. They knew exactly what they were selling. This is, we can unmask people for you. And who? Protesters, Muslims, anarchists, people trying to protect themselves from chemical warfare. And where? By looking just at that periocular area. As long as that's exposed, it's enough. It's not nearly as accurate as being able to have whole face. There's been rigorous studies on this, but it is absolutely possible. And when you combine it with other features, for instance, your voice, your gait, any distinctive marks like tattoos, your clothing, even just how your mask itself looks, you got something distinctive about it. All these things together make you exactly as identifiable as through other means. But this technology did not come up yesterday. This website did not just come up a few months ago. This is something that was developed and marketed by choice, knowing exactly what it would be used for. And then there's economic unsecurity. Aadhaar is a system in India, and I'm going to let actually an analyst from India herself explain the details of what that is.
Hey, Carina, can we try resharing your screen with audio enabled? I don't think we're capturing audio. We can't hear any audio video.
I apologize.
So I can hear you, but I'm not getting any audio or video from your slides if you're playing any audio right then.
Then we need to keep moving on.
Sure, no worries.
I apologize. I will be posting the slide deck, and it will have the audio and the video for the part that you just missed, apparently. Apologies to the audience. We thought we had that one nailed, but apparently not. Okay. So ADHAR actually is so multimodal, and it's used to authenticate oneself. Originally was voluntary and has quickly become something so deeply tied with various programs, public and private, that it is almost inescapable that you need to enroll. However, it actually turned out to be, again, very easy to undermine in various ways, to steal identities, to contaminate data, to assign existing records to oneself, etc. Here's this one exploit. And regulation is just becoming beholden to all these same values, managerial styles, procedural cadences, interests, and languages of communication as the applications of the technologies that it seeks to regulate. I'm going to skip ahead in a few things because we're running low on time. I want to talk about the panopticonic gaze. That's my little word here. So the film critic Laura Mulvey described a female gaze in the 1970s. She described it as essentially whose feelings, desires, and way of viewing the world are what are taken for granted as natural and inevitable and obvious beyond question. So for instance, cowboy movies and cop movies, those are very much the gaze of white American men and boys. That's who they're speaking to. That's whose eyes they're intended to be seen through. But then you have something like Moonlight, the movie Moonlight, which has a very distinctly Black male gaze. Biometrics have a panopticonic gaze. And what do I mean? Okay, so we have cultural genocide as the next big topics here, right? Human rights experts agree that cultural genocide is the correct term for the situation for ethnic Muslim Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province right now. What they are experiencing is being completely isolated in one region in mass, in the most heavily surveilled region in the world, where every few feet there is another camera. Every few blocks there is another police station. There is no aspect of life that isn't closely monitored constantly. In addition, over 1 million Uyghurs have disappeared into camps that have been euphemistically described as re-education camps. In fact, BuzzFeed recently managed to uncover many camps that have been very recently built, and they're enormous. This is just one camp, and I tried to put in some photos here to give you a visual reference point for the size. So this is roughly a comparison to Perth, Sydney, and Melbourne here. One camp. 1 million Uyghurs is pretty much more than every person in Canberra and Newcastle combined, just to give perspective on how many people have disappeared. Whose certainty is being reflected then? Well, American white men clearly, but also anyone who has American Standard English fluency and accent, since a lot of data is actually just coming from college students who are doing a study for their teacher in exchange for a grade or $15 or whatever it is. You just have the gaze of students who have stuff to deal with. You have CS doctoral candidates who are putting a lot of thought into something and who become the very small source of all authority on a given area. So their view becomes really dominant in their niche. Bureaucrats who issue licenses. When someone takes a photograph and decides that you are who they believe you are, that is the data that is following everywhere else. Anyone who's really into tagging you, like on Instagram and Facebook and stuff, becomes the gaze as well. Anyone that is able to click really fast on things like Mechanical Turk. Paparazzi, because a lot of training data sets for facial recognition are of paparazzi photographs of celebrities. Surveillance technicians' perspectives obviously are very much reflected. Police and also politicians, the people who buy the technology and set the standards for what they expect it to do, what they expect it to look like, what kind of role it should have. And looking at race recognition biometrics, here's a description of that one. It's about the shape of the human head in things like length, breadth, height, and that's one of the best available tests of race known. It was in 1899, and it's still essentially how today race is still being declared a biometric. It's not. It's still phrenology. It's still discredited junk science that's racist as hell. And racist junk science abounds. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates says, perhaps your instinct is to just point out that the problem is the interpretation of the data. Hey, we can tune it, right? But my instinct is to point out that your entire experiment proceeds from a basic flaw, which is that there's no coherent, fixed definition of race actually in existence. And really the problem that's deeper is, even if we make things more accurate, that's not for the betterment of oppressed people. Oppressed people do not benefit from having far more accurate policing of their bodies. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So I have some that I want to just break down very quickly. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. And so I'm just going to say that there's a whole lot to nitpick about these things, and this can give you some ideas about what things to be looking for. When a claim is made, are they speaking out of their own expertise, or are they appropriating expertise by proxy? For instance, Amazon making claims about its new Halo product, a smartwatch that supposedly can tell your emotions. It can't. Spoiler. So whose gaze is being validated and used? What's the basis? What's the science behind it all? Whose gaze again? What's been validated? What kind of confounding factors have been looked at? And is there consent? As well, what are the thresholds? Since all this is probabilistic, when you end up just assigning something as a polar, it's this or it's that, since it was a probabilistic prediction, how do we decide what a reasonable confidence level is for a consumer product to say that this is assuredly at a 0.9 or at a 0.97, 9742, who knows? But if you haven't expressed that, then there's a lot there that is really not being conveyed. That's important. And when you look closely at their own information, it turns out that there was no existing basis for their claims. They're not even trying to support their claims. Law enforcement has a really close relationship with Amazon Ring. This is in the US alone. It's being used for all sorts of policing of ordinary activities. Various companies have put a temporary suspension on sales of facial recognition. It's a 1-year suspension, and it's a distraction, because even though, for instance, Ring isn't facial recognition yet, Amazon is still one of the major companies that recently has declared that while it's suspending facial recognition with law enforcement, what it quietly didn't say is that it's not suspending it with other groups. It's not suspending it with militaries. It's not suspending it with paramilitary organizations such as ICE. It's very narrowly strategized. And really what it comes down to is its legislative strategy, because every monopolist's first preference, as Cory Doctorow describes it, is to be totally unregulated. But the second preference is to be regulated in a way that only a monopolist can comply with. So the biggest companies in the world all came to the realization that if we just take a year and coerce governments into doing this the way we want to, and locking out the rest of the market, that's totally worth taking a 1-year pause for PR reasons. Around the world, countries are using politically motivated internet blackouts to control. When you think about how biometrics are used, they really require dependency on internet access, on network access. And it's become really common in many countries to control populations by shutting off their access completely to the internet, including mobile. And it's at the cost of lives. Access to things like basic medical services, to being able to access emergency care. And it's around the world over and over again, we're seeing tragedies happen as a result of these shutdowns. And it's at the expense of programs that were meant to save lives. Function creep, this is that panopticon that I was referring to before. What is the basic notion of a panopticon? It's the architecture in which everyone is under continuous potential surveillance. There's one guard, but it's impossible to know when it's you being watched, and uncertainty ensures that there's universal self-policing so that one guard is always enough. And so constantly pushing the Overton window is how you build a panopticon. And there's so many ways for that to be slippery. And for Australia, for instance, recently had an example of this. The Identity Matching Services Bill of 2019 was really pushing the Overton window further in the direction of becoming a foreign intelligence function, and that's mandatory, centralized, and used for things like law enforcement, and without having to first get case-by-case court authorization, for instance. It was rejected, but the premises on which it was rejected suggests that actually it's likely that the concept of it will indeed get support, and that it just needs to be tweaked a little next time. And unfortunately, I've run out of time, and there's still a bunch more to go. So I'm going to skip forward to the end here, and I will be posting the entire slide deck. And I also will be giving this talk again at DjangoCon Europe in a couple of weeks in a longer version for a keynote. So there'll be another opportunity to get some of the stuff that you're unfortunately missing today. I apologize for that. So we're going to just rush forward. And it's too bad because you missed out on me snarking about my own. What can we do? We can draw a hard line and say that this is not okay to participate in. It's not okay for our cities to purchase. It's not okay to be installing it. It's not okay to be using in our home when guests come over, that they should not have it forced upon them without consent to have their biometrics also be collected just because I have purchased this technology for my home, for my office, for my school. Publish the data. Please be transparent. If you absolutely are making this technology or are buying it, always make sure that the algorithm is being published for transparency's sake, as well as the data. If it can possibly be, obviously there's serious privacy issues here, serious issues. But if it's using, for instance, pseudodata, that actually should be published. If it's using public data sets already, it should be published. And make sure there's citations to rigorous scientific research, because we're also dealing with the final issue of existential insecurity. The cost of training a research quality natural language processing model is just extraordinary. We're talking about 300,000 kilograms of CO2 just for one training. And that's equivalent to 164 flights from Adelaide to Los Angeles. Actually, it's more than that, but you know, it gives you a sort of a round number, right? And of course, we know that the effects of carbon impact are very real. This year alone, we've seen how extraordinarily rapidly those effects are being felt around the world, including bushfires, wildfires, record heat. Hey, 2020 keeps giving. All of these things can sound really harsh and critical and downer, but I really appreciate what Zainab said here, because criticism is really an optimistic perspective that something can be changed. Being resigned to it's too late, this already is happening, there's nothing you can do about it, that is profoundly pessimistic and heartless. We have to believe that we can disentangle our work from very real harms to masses of people, that we can take an active role in unraveling oppression being done to them. That is a very optimistic and loving approach to the world and to our industry. So hand back the power. It wasn't ours to be given away in the first place. We didn't have the right to take it. We didn't have the right to hand it off for someone else. And finally, I'm going to be providing resources here. I'll quickly just click through, but they will be available to you online as well. And I will be taking questions after the talk. Thank you so much. And again, I apologize, but I look forward to being able to share more with you later.
Thank you so much, Carina. And we all think you need to do a talk at DevOps next year about how to stay unbelievably calm when the technology wants to play dirty.
I can answer that later too.
We look forward to questions in the chat. So jump in there. There's been some good discussion. We are going to take a break for about half an hour now. So we'll be back about 11:45. Ooh, how do time zones work?
I'm not even in the right day.
1:45 Adelaide time will be back, or 1:15 Eastern time, and extrapolate out to other time zones, please. Thank you very much again, Carina.
Bye-bye. Thank you.